Hi there, friends. It's me again. A little while back, at least, I made a video with sort of like a bookshelf tour. I went around my room, I showed all my books, my sort of haphazard, not so great shelf setup. Since then, this room has definitely received a pretty great overhaul in terms of organization. Got some new paint going on. The floor is different, the rug's different, the shelving is different. It's hanging on the wall. Everything is pretty much better, but no one really remarked on the interior design. I did have a couple people though specifically say that they wanted to see my Stephen King collection highlighted a little bit more because, as you've seen in the back of my videos, as you can see here, there's a lot of Stephen King books, right? And it seems like people are usually pretty interested in Stephen King books, people's thoughts on his books, because there are just so darn many. And yeah, they fluctuate in terms of quality. As I'm learning now, I just started reading Cell by Stephen King, and I really don't know how I feel about it. And that's kind of been the theme of his 90s and early 2000s works for me. But beyond that, I still have a lot of love in my heart for the guy, some of his older work, and hopefully some of his newer work. Today, for those people who reached out on YouTube, on Instagram, by carrier pigeon, that they wanted to see my Stephen King collection, we're doing it for all of you today. We're going to go through my whole Stephen King collection in some detail. I don't want this to be like a 2-hour video, but if it ends up being feature film length, sometimes it's like that. I think probably the best place to start out is the ones I care about the least, and those are just some of the old paperbacks that I have that aren't that great. So let's start there. All right, I'm currently standing on a wobbly ottoman, couple feet off the floor. We're almost at the ceiling right now, so you can't say I'm not dedicated. I'm risking life and limb for this. So we'll start up here with some of the paperbacks. They're I love reading paperbacks, but in terms of display, not the absolute best. But regardless, let's take a look at a couple. I guess we'll start with the Colorado Kid, tiny little paperback. Great short read, solid. Old men writing for a newspaper. They got a new intern investigating murder, mystery. I love these hard case crime books. I think Stephen King's are particularly solid. He's talked about how much he likes Raymond Chandler in the past, whose books are right here. And yeah, definitely trying to replicate that sort of old, hard-boiled detective writing with some of these, and overall enjoy them. Also have a copy of the Bachman Regulators. Not the biggest fan of the Regulators. Between Desperation and this, definitely preferred Desperation, but it was fine. It was pretty action-packed. Also have Later from Stephen King. This is the most recent Hard Case Crimes edition from him with that publishing house, and I think probably may very well be the best out of those. We also have Joyland, which was another fun hard case crime book from Stephen King. This is one I read in maybe a sitting or two, not particularly overflowing with substance or complexity, but again, if you're in a bit of a rut, you want to read something fast and short from Stephen King, this is a good sort of mixture of that sort of old-fashioned Dean Koontz-esque thriller type of ride with a bit of Stephen King essence in it. And then I don't feel like upsetting the rest of this pile, but it's Mr. Mercedes and Gwendy's Magic Feather, two series that I don't have completely in my collection, but they're good. I think the Mr. Mercedes series, the Bill Hodges trilogy, definitely better than the Gwendy trilogy, in my opinion. But Gwendy's fine, very quick reads. If you need something to absolutely absorb and read without trying at all, those are great. We also have the Bazaar of Bad Dreams. This is one of the first, I think this is the first Stephen King book that I bought brand new around when it was released. At least it was the first Stephen King short story collection that I ever read. So this was sort of the precedent, the first exposure to short story Stephen King, and I think there are a lot of really good short stories in this. So if you're into his short story work and you want a solid collection, Bazaar of Bad Dreams, definitely a good one to check out. I also have a paperback of Dr. Sleep, great sequel, underrated follow-up to The Shining, and then one of his nonfiction exploits, a very old, crinkled, like browning, yellowing paged copy of
Danse Macabre,
which is sort of historical adventure through the history of different horror that has inspired King, just sort of like the proliferation and sort of boom with some classic horror authors as well as horror movies. You know, it's great if you're sort of like a horror geek and you're into horror history. Definitely check it out. I had fun reading this. A nice little movie cover, probably my least favorite looking Stephen King book I own, of Carrie. Luckily, I eventually got the first edition, so this wasn't the only one I had, but this was the first edition of Carrie I had. It was very disappointing, but I think I got it for like 63 cents at a secondhand shop, so it was worth it. And this is Stephen King's first novel that he put out under his name. Very solid book, very quick read. We have another one of King's nonfiction. I have this in hardback as well, which we'll see, but paperback edition of On Writing, one of my favorite books by Stephen King in general. This is like a nice sort of peek under the hood when it comes to a lot of his books, his writing process. Whether you're into writing or you're into Stephen King or somewhere in between, I definitely think this is a worthwhile one to check out in On Writing. We also have Lisey's Story. I bought this at a used bookshop in the Finger Lakes up in New York, and I think it's one of Stephen King's most underrated books. I think it's one of those books from him that you either love or you hate. Next, again, we are just dancing with fire here with some of these piles. Roadwork from Stephen King, one of the darker, I would say they're all pretty dark when it comes to the Bachman books. I'm going to make a video in the future sort of ranking all of his Bachman books, but Roadwork is probably one of my favorites. Very intense one too. So, and then finally, one of my favorite paperbacks of Stephen King's, a very old, decrepit copy of The Stand. I don't even remember where I got this from, but I love that like metallic cover on the back and then like the menacing eyes there on the front. And then we're down to a couple of the last ones here. Insomnia. I've talked about this book a couple times. Obviously, this is the paperback version. We'll get to the hardback one then. But one of Stephen King's most underrated books here, and a great book that is very much so like steeping in Dark Tower things. So check it out if you're into that. And we're just gonna do these last three. We have The Running Man, which is a very fun, like dystopian game show. We also have Thinner, probably one of the most off-color, pretty offensive, insensitive books from Stephen King. Definitely an interesting one. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, but yeah, just didn't feel like it felt very well situated in like the context of the 2020s. And finally, Different Seasons, one of my favorite novella collections, and I absolutely love the little paperback version of this. I love that like greenish, bluish, teal tint to it. Definitely an old copy. It's not in the worst condition, but this has some of the best novellas from Stephen King, with Shawshank, with, if you've seen Stand By Me, the movie, the book, The Body is in here, as well as Apt Pupil. All right, here we are, back on the ground floor, no longer at a significant fall risk. So we'll move to my first row of first editions, which in some cases, I've spent a pretty penny on a few of these editions, but remarkably, a lot of these I've gotten for between like $1 and $3 at either like massive used book sales, or like going to Goodwill or other secondhand shops, or like having free ones just given to me by somebody who either bought it or had it and didn't know what to do with it. Yeah, I've been pretty lucky to build out this collection without a ton of actual like financial investment. So we'll start over here. We of course have I don't think it's technically like a first edition, first printing. I need to confirm that still, but we have Carrie, and I have it in that like protective plastic slip. This is one of those examples of one that I may as well have gotten for free. My local library was having one of those like fill up a bag for $4 or $5, like one of the few books that I was like desperately looking for a first edition of. And I think Lauren and I got probably like 20 books that day. One of the like cheapest, technically, first editions of Stephen King that I got. And I think it's a way better cover than that like sort of like movie tie-in modern one. So an equal amount of affection for it. The Stand, again, I don't know if this is like an absolute first edition. If it is, it's been like beaten to crap at this point. The sort of edges are fraying for the dust jacket. The pages are like, it looks like Neapolitan ice cream in there. Not the best, but I absolutely love this cover. I love the edition. I love the bold font. And yeah, overall, I think the Doubleday and the Viking covers are some of the best when it comes to Stephen King's work. The Stand, one of my favorites. My sister picked this up at like a used book tent sale and just gave it to me, and I was like, this is like the coolest book anyone's ever given me, so thanks. And yeah, I love this. It can also be used as like a brick or a doorstop. So the rest of the shelf, we have Salem's Lot, of course, one of my favorite books of all time, one of my favorite Stephen King books in general. And I love this cover. I love the little like image of Jerusalem's lot there in the O. I think it would make for like the coolest tattoo to get that. And yeah, again, these sort of older editions of Stephen King's work are some of the coolest, in my opinion. I love the way old horror books look. I also have a Dead Zone copy. This is a first edition, and I absolutely love the book and I love the movie, so Dead Zone always has a nice place in my heart. Love the hardback, love that sort of like updated font. Again, the big, bold Stephen King covers are like my favorite out of any books. Next on the list is Firestarter. This was the first time I ever got in an eBay bidding war, like down to the final seconds with somebody. Absolutely thrilling experience. I don't even remember how much I paid for it, but I absolutely needed to have it, and I think it's one of the coolest covers out of Stephen King's work. Now here's where things get a little bit more gross, is this copy of Cujo, which I'm not actually even gonna like take a look at too much. It's disgusting. It doesn't have a dust jacket. If you happen to have like a Cujo dust jacket sitting around, feel free to send it my way. Message me. I'll get back to you. The next one of my, this may be up there and like, this one may be up there like all-time 5-10 favorite covers, is Christine. This is one of the cleanest designs out of Stephen King's covers, and probably up there with like top 5 favorite first editions for me when it comes to his work. Beautiful cover, such a fun story. I know people don't love this one all the time, but I remember reading it in the summer. I think I was either just out of college or I was still in college. Campy a little bit, but in the best ways, and I need to see the movie still for this, but I love Christine and I love this edition. Another one of my favorite Stephen King books in general, awesome cover, the Peter Straub Stephen King collaboration on The Talisman. This is one of my favorite King books in general, one of my favorite stories. Anything that's sort of similar to The Dark Tower usually falls under that category for me. And yeah, great first edition there. We also have The Skeleton Crew, really solid short story collection. This one has The Mist, Survivor Type, a few other really solid short stories in this one. I think one of his better short story collections. The next one, not a hardback. I got a paperback edition of it. This was another eBay bidding war, one that I probably paid a little bit too much money for, but I really wanted it. And that's the collection of the Bachman books by Stephen King. I love the big plain black edition of this. Yeah, I think it just looks great. There are some pretty intense ones in this that I have editions for otherwise, like the Singular Stories, but I had never read Rage, which is the book that like Stephen King self-banned due to some like tragedies in the educational space. This focuses on a student that like holds his classmates hostage, so it's totally understandable given like the recent context of everything in America. But yeah, I really like this edition and it was well worth the money. The next one everybody knows, is probably the heaviest edition of anything I have, Stephen King's It. Another one of my underrated favorites out of Stephen King's work. The fantasy work Eyes of the Dragon. Love the green hardback edition of it. One of my favorites. The detail on the dragon drawing is just so cool, and I love this story. We also have Misery here, another very cool first edition. I absolutely love like the shadow of Annie Wilkes on the wall with the axe. One of my favorite Stephen King books, one that I read pretty close to when my girlfriend read it, so there's like that sentimental value in it as well, reading it with somebody else. And yeah, just an overall like classic Stephen King story. Next one, I'm not even gonna do the justice of talking about too much. It's the Tommyknockers. This is probably my least favorite Stephen King book out of all of them. And then one of my other least favorite Stephen King books, I have 2 editions of them, The Dark Half. All right, moving down another shelf, quite a few more here. We have Dolores Claiborne, another really solid book, sort of paired up with its Eclipse counterpart, Gerald's Game. This is one of the most like traumatizing Stephen King works that I've read, as well as the movie adaptation on Netflix. Super intense, but love those sort of paired up there. We also have 4 Past Midnight, which has a couple great novellas in there, namely The Langoliers, which is about this like airplane where people fall asleep, they wake up and they're like in a completely different place, different dimension. Everyone else like is sort of out of commission, and I read it right before going on a trip that required me to get on a plane, so I'll always remember this one. Absolutely love that like cracked light emanating from the clock on the cover. Great addition there. And these are some of my favorites, this like Stephen King font aesthetic with The Needful Things as well, one of the books I read last year, and then of course Nightmares and Dreamscapes, where the end of my like true passionate love for the Stephen King like cover aesthetic kind of ends when it comes to his first editions. We also have Insomnia, just a couple massive books in a row. This one very bold, not a lot going on, pretty simple. I like it. Then we have Rose Matter, a book I recently talked about on one of my Stephen King tier lists. This is one of the first editions that I got out of Stephen King's work. Pretty boring cover, but you know, solid story. Then we move into Desperation. This is one of either 2 or 3 copies of this book I have. I have another 2 up there, and there is his counterpart, The Regulators, and a few books I haven't read yet. I read Hearts in Atlantis a while back, but it was in my very early days of reading Stephen King. Like, I don't even think I had a Goodreads or anything yet. I think I was either in high school or early college, and I definitely want to reread this because I read it also before I ever read The Dark Tower, and obviously like it's not entirely necessary to like read all these things in a specific order, but I definitely want to read this one again, so I intend to do that pretty soon. But yeah, we also have The Regulators. I'm not going to pull all these apart, but Bag of Bones, not a great one. Hardback edition of On Writing, Dreamcatcher, which I've yet to read, and the follow-up sequel, second book to The Talisman, Stephen King and Peter Straub's Black House. I really hope this video isn't that long. I'm just realizing how many Stephen King books I have by doing this, so maybe this is a solid wake-up call. But we still got even more. From a Buick 8, again, one of my favorite underrated Stephen King books. Really solid one. Again, I'm a sucker for like the family-based stories, and this is definitely one of those. So really solid. Cell, just talked about it before, first edition of that one, but not too proud of it considering how much I'm not really enjoying reading the book so far. Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, another first edition. Don't love it, don't hate it. It's just kind of like a meh in-between book for me, but solid edition there. Lisey's Story, I think it is one of the coolest first editions out of all of Stephen King's work, especially when you consider the more modern ones. You can see that sort of like floral underlay under the shovel there. And then when you pull the dust cover back, it's got like the whole thing going on all around it. So very solid edition there. Another one of my favorite, more contemporary works from Stephen King, and one of my favorite editions is Duma Key. Solid book. So good. And feels like there's some sort of connection to The Dark Tower when you consider like the whole Patrick Danville character with the main character in this with their like artistic ability. Another one I haven't read from Stephen King, Just After Sunset. I don't know if this is a novella collection or a short story collection, but I intend to read it somewhat soon. We also have 2 copies of Under the Dome, a paperback, and then this hardback. This was like one of the beefiest books I've ever had to carry around with me while I was reading it. And yeah, absolutely massive book. And I think it's a pretty fun one. Another one I haven't read yet, Full Dark, No Stars. Another one I haven't read yet, but I intend to this year. Very excited about it. Mostly hear pretty great things about it. Revival from Stephen King. And then one of his all-time sort of contemporary classics, 11/22/63. This is one of those Stephen King books that I wouldn't just recommend to Stephen King fans or horror fans. I would recommend this book to just like anybody who enjoys reading in general. And I think it's a really cool addition with that sort of newspaper cover, sort of considering the content of this. It's just a super cool sort of juxtaposition with like the alternate reality on the back cover where he escapes assassination. Very cool exploration of the JFK assassination, sort of like alternate history, alternate pasts. And then some of his newer work, we have a copy of The Institute. Very solid story there. We have If It Bleeds, which has one of the sort of like primary Holly Gibney stories to it, which is very relevant considering Holly, which is coming out later in 2023. Very excited about that, and really liked all of the stories in this collection. We have Billy Summers, very polarizing book for a lot of Stephen King fans and just people in general. Thought it was solid, didn't love it, didn't hate it. We have Fairy Tale, his most recent release. Really like that first edition, gives like hardcore fantasy vibes, which is very necessary considering the book itself. But yeah, and then we have Gwendy's Final Task. Again, I don't love the Gwendy books. They just feel like they're not all that substantial, and like there's some Dark Tower connection. As you can see on the cover here, there's some Randall Flagg related things going on, but it just feels really insubstantial compared to sort of the representation we get in the actual Dark Tower universe. So not my absolute favorite from Stephen King, but they're really quick reads. They're solid enough. All right, and here we are on pretty much the bottom shelf with the exception of some stuff down here, which are just sort of extra paperback copies. But these are sort of the last fun editions I have to talk about in the last shelf. I have a copy of Salem's Lot here, just normal paperback one. Have two copies of this, The Shining, probably one of the least favorite editions for that book, which I happen to have duplicates of. Got the paperback of The Outsider, again, one of the most underrated solid Stephen King books in recent memory. And then I have a terrible copy of The Drawing of the Three. This is unfortunately the only copy of this one that I have, so we'll probably always be on the search for an affordable version of the hardback. Just like one of the most expensive Stephen King books to find is that hardback edition for this, like the first edition one. So I may just be stuck with this one forever. Same goes for Wizard and Glass. I just have the normal old paperback for that. And then we have the Green Mile. We have the serialized version of the 6-part Green Mile publications, and then Night Shift and The Shining again. Besides that, we have sort of the last things worth mentioning here. Hardback edition of Wind Through the Keyhole. I think it's one of the cooler covers, cooler editions for Stephen King's books. We also have the least cool Gunslinger edition here, the one with Idris Elba on the front from the most like disdained, deplorable movie adaptation of a Stephen King book in the history of Stephen King adaptations. So definitely need to update this edition at some point. Really cool paperback edition of The Wastelands. I found this at Goodwill as well, and this has that sort of like full illustration set in there. Really enjoyed reading this one, and I don't even feel a need to upgrade this paperback because I think this is an amazing edition in itself. The Plume people did a really nice job with those. Same with this Wizard and Glass one, has all the illustrations. Really enjoyed this book in general, one of my favorites. Would love a hardback someday, probably not gonna happen. Finally, we have 2 editions of Wolves of the Kala. I think the paperback and the hardback are equally as cool. There's the paperback with that sort of stormy landscape there. And then the hardback, of course, in solid condition, has Susanna Dean there on the front, chucking some discs, doing some target practice. Really, really cool edition there. And then finally, second to last, Song of Susanna, first edition hardback there, followed, of course, by a first edition of Book 7, Stephen King's The Dark Tower. So absolutely love these Dark Tower first editions. Very cool with the included illustrations. So that is my Stephen King collection. I don't really know who this video was for outside of people who also collect Stephen King, who are nerds about all the first editions, like his books. But it was fun to sort of go through my whole collection there, talk about each book, look at each edition, and if there are any major changes, overhauls, I'm sure you'll see it in the background of videos. And yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know if you enjoyed this. Leave a like, subscribe. We'll catch up next time. Peace.